Welcome to Inside Israel with Joel Chasnoff. That is me coming to you tonight from Ra'anana, back in Israel after a very long spring tour in the US and Canada. And I must say, despite everything going on here in Israel right now, it is good to be home. You know, a friend of mine asked me today whether it's more intense here in Israel and therefore harder to be here or easier being so close to the news and so close to everything happening. And she thought I would say it was easier being here on the one hand because you're closer to everyone else and you can have what's called the chibuk, the hug of society to help you get through all the hard times. But she also said she would understand if I said it was easier to be in the US. And I explained that, yeah, sometimes it is easier to be away because you hear the bad news, you hear the difficult situations, but then next thing you know, you're in Starbucks or Target and you kind of forget. You can lose yourself in American society. But at the same time, I do prefer to be here. It is hard because the news is so intense and you are so close to it. And this was a very difficult week for us Israelis, a very difficult weekend, to be more specific. But at the same time, that's the very same reason I would rather not be anywhere else. I want to be close to those who are going through it with me and go through that shared experience, which I think is at least what, for me, living in Israel is all about. And tonight, I want to bring you some of those insights about what this week was like. The title of tonight's broadcast is Coffee, Bagel, and Napkins for My Tears. And that was a title I came up with about 48 hours ago before we had this very difficult Shabbat here in Israel. And the title alludes to what was really the biggest piece of news for the past week up until Shabbat came in. The big news, of course, that I'm talking about is the rescue operation of 4 Israeli hostages from where they were being held in Gaza. And I'm not going to go through the exact details of how the operation went down because you can all read about that in other places. You can even see amazing, amazing video from the helmet cams of soldiers as they burst into the apartment and rescued the hostages. It really is incredible to see. What I want to do is sort of give some insights into why this rescue operation was so meaningful to Israelis and how it is different for those who live here as opposed to others in the world, specifically Jews everywhere else. And the title itself, Coffee, Bagel, and Napkins for My Tears, that's an allusion to the moment I found out about this rescue operation. I had been in New York last weekend. Already, by the way, it seems like months ago, but it was only just over a week ago. I was in New York for an event at Temple Beth Israel in Port Washington on Long Island, and I was staying in Manhattan. And that Saturday morning, I went to get coffee and a bagel at the place down the street from where I'm staying. And I want to allude to, just mention that it's interesting here in Israel. I try very much to be as Shomer Shabbat as I can when I'm here. I will use electricity, but I try to avoid using my phone unless it's to talk to family about plans. Don't go on the news. Don't check the internet. Don't do email on Shabbat. And also try not to spend money on Shabbat here in Israel unless it's part of a family trip or an outing. But when I'm in the US, it's much different. Will go and get a coffee and bagel in the morning on a Saturday morning, as I did when I was there. And I'd been to this coffee bagel place before on the Upper East Side, and I knew that the young woman working the counter often is this young woman named Noah, who is Israeli. And as soon as I came in, she said, "Have you heard the news?" And I hadn't heard the news because I was trying not to check my phone on Shabbat. And she told me about the rescue operation. And I sat down at the table in this cafe and cried, and not just like a little sniffly cry, like literally bawling my eyes out, crying. And I know I'm not the only one who did this. I know many Israelis here in Israel broke down at hearing the news, but also a lot of Israelis in the US and American Jews and Jews around the world upon hearing this news. It was such an emotional moment to hear about these 4 hostages being rescued. And what I want to share with you tonight is what our feelings about this operation reveal about the Israeli psyche. Because I think that's what the real story is here. You can go online and and read about how the operation actually happened and tactically what the IDF did. But to me, the real story is Israelis' reaction to it. What does it say about us, and what does it say about Israelis that we reacted as we did? So those are the three narratives that I want to share with you related to this rescue operation. And then, of course, we'll get into the big news of the week and I'll look at your questions. So first, some background on this raid. It took place on Saturday, uh, June 8th, and it was a daytime raid. So that's already one thing that was very different about this. It took place during the daytime. Another, I don't know how much attention this got in the US, but another big element here in Israel is that Benny Gantz, who at that point was still in the war cabinet, he had given an ultimatum that he was going to leave the war cabinet on June 8th if certain conditions weren't met, specifically if there was not a day after plan put in place for Gaza by June 8th. And he scheduled a press conference for the night of June 8th. And there's speculation here in Israel that because Gantz knew about this hostage rescue operation far ahead of time, long before it took place, that this scheduling of the press conference itself was a ruse, that he knew he would end up canceling this press conference, but he scheduled it to sort of throw a MacGuffin at Hamas and sort of lead them into believing that June 8th was just going to be a normal day and night like any other. And scheduling a press conference communicates that nothing else interesting is going to be happening on that day. And so that one of the reasons he scheduled it was to throw off Hamas. And this didn't mean he wasn't going to actually leave the government. He did. In fact, he has since you and I last met. But the scheduling itself may have been another piece of the operation, some of the trickery involved. The hostages were being held in two buildings. And as I said, you can see body cam, helmet cam, and footage of the actual raid itself. But let's now dig into the operation and what it says about how Israelis are reacting to it and why we're reacting the way we are. And what I want to touch on is the Israeliness of this operation. So, first of all, the planning took place a long time before June 8th. And what really allowed this to happen was that Israel sent in an undercover unit. They're called mistaravim. This is a unit in the IDF. It's very elite. You typically don't know who is in this unit. Mistaravim, it's sort of a quirk in modern Hebrew that you can take any word and turn it into an adjective or a verb. And mistaravim, the shoresh, the root of that word is arav, which is Arab. And lehistarev is a new verb that we've developed here in Israel, a modern verb, which means to dress up as an Arab or to turn yourself into an Arab. Lehistarev. And this army unit of mistaravim, what they do is they disguise themselves as Palestinians and they live amongst the Palestinian population at various times as a way of gathering intelligence. Sometimes they'll go in for a few hours. Sometimes they will live there for weeks and months. They speak obviously fluent Arabic. They have a certain look. You can't be in this unit if you don't have that look. And so in this case, the IDF sent a team of men and women. And I think that's something that we really need to highlight here as well, that women mista'araviot, women operatives took part in this mission as well. And they lived amongst the Gazans in this neighborhood where the hostages were being held. And the point of them living there was to gather intelligence and find the exact locations where they were. So they went in, they had a backstory. They said they had lived in northern Gaza, but then came down in order to, because they were fleeing operations, fleeing the Israeli bombardments. And so they were looking to rent an apartment in this part of Gaza. And they shopped and went to the same everything. They immersed themselves in Gazan society, whether it was grocery stores or other places of business, or just hanging out in the local market, wherever they were, their goal was to listen to what was happening and gather as much information as possible about the hostages. So that was step one. And this is a very Israeli aspect of the operation, and it brings to mind the best of what the IDF has always done, which is that element of surprise and that element of being one step ahead of the enemy. And I think since October 7th, there had been a feeling in Israel that we lost some of that edge, that we were playing catch up to an enemy that was ahead of us. So one reason this operation so impacted Israelis the way it did and brought us such joy was because I think it brought to mind that IDF of old, that IDF that was always one step ahead and was a little more clever and could take action without the enemy knowing. And that was part of the joy we experienced when we found out about this rescue. Number two was the sense of community and shared mission, that we are one people. You know, before October 7th, even on October 6th, there was talk of civil war here in Israel, and the country was really torn apart. Judicial reform split Israeli society in many ways, whether it's secular and religious, Sephardic, Ashkenaz, high socioeconomic class versus lower, really anything you can imagine. Society was split along those lines. And then October 7th, in an amazing way, brought the country together, and that lasted for a number of months. But recently, we've been seeing society become fragmented again. There's the issue of the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, not serving in the Israeli army while the rest of us shoulder the burden. There's political infighting and bickering happening specifically between the Likud government that's in power and the opposition party, which Benny Gantz left and Gadi Eisenkot left. This raid, this rescue operation, it showed the best of what Israel is. It reminded Israelis that at the end of the day, we are one people and we are one community. And we send in our soldiers to rescue our hostages and even sacrifice our soldiers' lives to bring back civilians who've been taken captive by the enemy. And in the end, this operation was named after the soldier who lost his life in this operation, Amnon. Originally it had a different name, but it was changed to Miftzat Amnon, which is Operation Amnon in his memory. And I heard stories about how in Israel, secular Jewish Israelis were writing notes about the operation and taping it to the door of religious Israeli neighbors because they knew their religious neighbors would not have the news on, would not have their television or their phones on. So they were leaving notes for them. And when secular Israelis would see religious Israelis in the street on that Saturday, they would say, "Have you heard the news?" And they would fill them in on the news because they knew the religious neighbors, the religious Israeli Jews, wouldn't be able to watch TV, hear the radio, check their phones. And it was the same in New York as well. I was in New York and I passed a number of Hebrew speakers, and anytime we passed each other, the first thing we said was "Shamatem, Shamatem," meaning "Did you hear? Did you hear?" And usually we all had heard already. But we were ecstatic and we wanted to share the news because I think we were reveling in the idea that we were one people again, even if it was only for a few hours. Believe me, it was not lost on any of us that there are still over 100 hostages remaining. This is not the end of the story, but we just felt like for that hour or two, we could truly rejoice in the shared narrative that we have and how we are really Kol Yisrael Aravim Ze Lazeh, meaning all of Israel is looking out for one another. It brought back that idea that we are unified. And I think that was the second really big point. It's just how eager we were to share the news with each other and to be a unified people again. The third aspect of this rescue operation that really touched us is It brought back the badass nature of the Israeli army that we know and love and have missed for a very long time. You know, Israel is renowned for some of these spectacular military operations. First and foremost was what comes to mind is Mivtzat Yonatan, Operation Yonatan. It was originally known as Operation Entebbe. This is the Entebbe raid in July. It's actually July 4th of 1976, America's bicentennial. But Israelis remember that date as the raid on Entebbe. And this is when hostages were on an Air France flight. The flight was hijacked. The plane was landed in Uganda. And through a brilliant military operation commanded by Yoni Netanyahu, Zichrono Livracha, the younger brother of the current prime minister, all of the hostages were in fact rescued. And what's meaningful here is that they weren't just Israeli hostages, but they were Jewish. Some were Israeli and some were simply Jewish. And it really communicated the idea that the Israeli army is not just the army of Israel, it is the army of the Jews, the Jewish people. You know, other operations are reminiscent of this as well. There's the Munich operations, where we eventually hunted down those who carried out the massacre at the Munich Olympics. And there's the bombing of Iran's nuclear reactor. These operations which no one expected, no one could have foreseen, but where the mighty and badass Israeli army went in and did the job. And like I said, we feel like since October 7th, that part has been missing, that part of the narrative. We've been playing catch up. We've been caught off guard. We've lost far too many soldiers. And this operation, it brought back some of that amazing capability that the IDF has and that we're proud of. And frankly, that we Israelis want more of. I'll get to this in a second, but one of the big complaints in Israel right now is that we're letting our north be burned. Literally, that Hezbollah is bombing the north, and it's so hot here right now that even when these missiles are exploded in the air, the shrapnel falls, catches in the dry grass and trees, and we're losing acres of forests, and we're not doing anything. We want more of a reaction. And so this rescue operation, it brought back that spirit of what the IDF is at its best. And the takeaway here is that this rescue operation really meant something differently to Israelis than it did, I think, to Jews around the world. I think for most Jews in North America that I know, the operation represented exactly what it was at face value, the rescue of 4 soldiers and how wonderful that is. But for Israelis, it was this other side as well. The idea that we were clever once again and ahead of our enemy. The idea that we're unified and the idea that the Israeli army in what it can do when it's at its best was back. We'll now go on to the news, and there's a lot of news that we could talk about this week. I wanted to choose 3 as always. So I chose the 3 that really I think are the most poignant in terms of what Israelis are talking about right now. The biggest news story, if you're not following, it's what we were calling already the Asson, the disaster yesterday in Gaza. 8 soldiers were killed yesterday morning. They were members of the Handasa Kravit combat engineers. And I've spoken about this unit several times on Inside Israel, because if there's one unit that suffered the most losses, without checking the numbers, I would have to guess it is combat engineers. And the reason is they are the ones who are responsible for blowing up the tunnels. They go in and fight against the enemy under very intimate, literally face-to-face conditions. The tunnels that they are tasked with blowing up sometimes have been booby-trapped, and so we've lost soldiers that way. Also, they travel with a large number of explosives. The only way you can blow up these tunnels is if you're traveling with dynamite and other explosives. So when their vehicles get hit, whereas other vehicles, if they were hit, it might be able to repel the attack, or it might not. It might be blocked by the armor. when it's combat engineers, there's so much ordnance inside that the whole vehicle explodes. And it seems that these 8 soldiers were literally killed by the own explosives they were carrying. They were on a series of nighttime missions that Friday night, June 14th, and then early Saturday morning, around 5 a.m., they were returning in a long caravan of vehicles, and this one vehicle was hit by, we believe, an RPG. It was either an RPG fired by Hamas or a roadside bomb that had been planted there ahead of time. And in any case, their vehicle, it's called a namer in Hebrew, which means tiger, but it's initials. I'm not sure what it, probably like a Humvee in English. It exploded immediately, and all 8 soldiers who were inside were killed. And this is the highest number of soldiers killed in one incident since, I believe, January. And it's a country where I've told you before that when even one soldier is killed, it is a huge news story. You know, we all send our kids to the army. Most of us have been to the army ourselves. We all know somebody in Gaza right now at this moment. I do, and just about everyone you talk to knows somebody who's serving in Gaza. And so when even one soldier is killed, it's a cause for mourning in Israeli society. And to have 8 killed at the same time was devastating. And another thing it did is it pushed the good news of the rescue operation from the week before already to the back page. I mean, there are still stories about the rescue operation and what the hostages who were freed are going through and what the rescue was like from their point of view. But so much of it, and this happens in Israel all the time, where one big story will be quickly pushed to the sidelines. In any other country in the world, what would be a big news story, in Israel, it disappears after 48 hours. I mean, on April 13th, Israel was attacked by Iran with 300 drones and missiles by Iran. And already, a month and a half later, we've pretty much completely forgotten about that because so many other big news stories have taken its place. And that's exactly what happened this week. The news of the hostage rescue operation was overshadowed by all the news of the week, but really culminating in this tragic, tragic episode in which 8 soldiers were killed from the combat engineers, and another 2 were killed this morning in Rafah, bringing a total of 10 killed over the weekend. So a very, very hard Shabbat for us here in Israeli society, and you can't escape it. You know, I was listening to the radio today and on the news in the car. If you've been to Israel, you know that every hour on the hour they give a news report. It's just what they do in Israel. And they were playing excerpts from the eulogies that brothers were giving to their siblings who had fallen, that parents were giving to their children, that the principal of a school was giving to one of his teachers, a reservist who was killed yesterday in Rafah. It's simply harrowing, and it's affecting all of us. So that was the big news story, is the story of these 10 soldiers who were killed over the weekend. The second big story that Israelis are talking about is, it's very much related. The Knesset today, unbelievably, raised the age for reserve duty retirement. So it used to be that you were out of the reserves at the age of 40, or if you were an officer at the age of 45. But today, the Knesset voted to raise that by 1 year. So if you are a soldier in the reserves, you now have to serve another year until you're 41. And if you're an officer, until 46. And that's retroactive now. So if you are 40 years old and you are about to get out of the reserves, guess what? You just got hit with another year of reserve duty, including this war with Lebanon that's starting upcoming. And this is related to the first story so poignantly because it seems like to most Israelis, such chutzpah, that in the same weekend when we lost 10 soldiers, that they would tell those of us who are serving in the army that we now have to serve another year. Meanwhile, the ultra-Orthodox have been given again exemptions from serving in the IDF. This has still not been solved. They are still finding ways to get around it, and the Netanyahu government is still refusing to follow the attorney general's, the chief of staff's, the minister of defense's recommendations to start drafting the ultra-Orthodox. And it's for political reasons. Netanyahu knows that the minute he starts drafting the Orthodox into the IDF, his coalition will fall apart and he will be out of power. So he is literally putting more of the burden on that sector of society that already serves and letting those who don't serve and who receive money from us, the taxpayers, for their yeshiva studies and for their children, to go on not serving. So this is a huge story here. The absolute, I can't say it's hypocrisy, but the absolute, it just blows our minds that the government could tell those who are already serving that they need to now serve more while refusing to draft this huge segment of the population that is not giving what they should be giving. As I said, last year alone, 2023, 66,000 ultra-Orthodox Jews were given exemptions from serving in the IDF. And for the time being, it looks like that is going to continue. I believe that by the end of this year, something will give. Somehow this will be resolved. We Israelis will not continue to stand for it. And yet, right now, there are no tools to actually make that happen. As long as the government refuses to, it's going to keep on continuing that way. The third news story, and it was hard to choose what the third one would be, but I would have to say it's all the government infighting that's happening right now. As I mentioned, after October 7th, we were a very unified society, but that unity is coming apart. And as I mentioned, Eisenkot and Gans, who were two members of the war cabinet, former chiefs of staff that we really trusted, they left the war cabinet because they believed that Netanyahu was not running the war correctly and that he has no plan for a day after. And it's true, there is no plan for a day after yet. Whether it's the right move for them to leave the war cabinet, that Israelis are not so sure about. Some believe that, yes, this is the only way to send a message that we're not just going to stand for the government's policies, but others are thinking this is not a good idea for them to leave because they were the voices of reason. That as long as you had Eisenkot and Gans in the war cabinet, at least you know that Netanyahu wasn't simply running the war by himself. But now that they're gone, there's really no one to check Netanyahu. So Israelis are torn on whether or not it's actually a good idea. But you're seeing the bickering take place. Eisenkot yesterday publicly accused Netanyahu of dragging his heels on an operation to go into Rafiah, because he was worried about the political consequences of doing so. As I've said before, we had been threatening to go into Rafah since March. It took us about 3 months before we actually did. And all that entire time, those 3 months, we gave a chance to Hamas to plant these roadside bombs, to accumulate ammunition, to organize into militias in Rafah, to booby-trap buildings and tunnels. 3 months when we weren't there, we basically gave them a head start. And, Netanyahu was blaming Gans and Eisenkot that they didn't give the green light, but ultimately Netanyahu is the one who pulls the strings and could have made the call, and we did not go in for those 3 months. And we're seeing a lot of infighting right now in the government, and this idea of unity that we had right after October 7th, it's beginning to shatter, and it's a little worrying what's ahead, because as I've said before, I think ultimately the biggest threat to Israel is not Iran or Hezbollah or Hamas or Islamic Jihad. It's what we have to deal with on the inside. It's figuring out what kind of country we want to be, how we resolve that question of Jewish country or country for Jews, which is not the same thing. We have the Jews who refuse to serve in the army. We have those in the West Bank who are living on land that is not belonging that does not belong to Israel. These are the issues we have to resolve. And once we figure out those, the other external threats will be a lot easier. So those are the three stories I wanted to share with you about the news this week. In a moment, I'm going to go to your questions. We have only two questions this week. But first, I want to give you a little commentary and just share a little slice of life of what I'm seeing. Today is Father's Day, so hey, happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. Only one of my four children remembered, and it's because she happens to be in the US, here in Israel. I don't blame them for forgetting. It's not a thing here in Israel. Nobody knows, so no hard feelings. But I actually want to talk about the moms today because I had the chance to have some conversations with some mothers. I've only been back in Israel about 72 hours since my most recent trip, but I've had a chance to talk to a few moms, friends of Dorit's, and we went to Shabbat dinner to some friends. And what I've noticed is that the moms in Israel are really freaking out, specifically the ones who have sons who are 16 and 17 years old right now. We have one friend whose son is a junior. He just finished his junior year of high school, what we call here Yud Aleph, 11th grade. And he wants to be in the Shayetet, which is the Navy SEALs. And this guy is an athlete and he's strong and he has the build. And I think in most other eras, parents would support their kids going to these kind of elite units because we know it's what you do in Israel and you want to give your best. And we really haven't had that many conflicts. I'm pretty sure that until October 7th, for the past number of years, the largest number of soldiers' deaths came from either suicides or from accidents, training accidents, not from combat itself. Combat deaths have been low in recent years up until October 7th. So there'd always been a lot of support for our sons going to these elite units. But now, when boys talk about going to Navy SEALs or paratroopers or really any combat units, the mothers are against it, the ones I'm talking to, and they're panicking and they're not themselves. And in general, it feels right now like Israelis are on edge. We're already 8.5, just about months into this phenomena, this post-October 7th reality. And it's hitting us very hard. We are forced to live a dual life. On the one hand, we are required to go to our jobs and earn a living and be social with people and get together with friends. And on the other hand, the emotional burden is so strong of knowing that the hostages are still there, of knowing that we have a deal on the table that our own government is waffling about, but that Hamas seems to be rejecting, even though this deal that Israel proposed is pretty much exactly what Hamas had asked for in its most recent rejection of our previous offer. And soldiers are dying, and more soldiers are being called up. We had a soldier last week who committed suicide because he'd been called up again. He'd already taken part in operations in Gaza. He came out with severe PTSD. And then last week, he was called up again. And this is a father, I think, of three. And he was so overcome emotionally with the idea of going back to Gaza that he took his own life. And originally, the army was not going to bury him as a fallen as a fallen soldier, but his family protested, and they did in the end. He was buried as a fallen soldier. But the toll of living here is becoming very, very strong and very hard, and it's taking a toll on all of us, and specifically the mothers. I'm noticing that a lot of the mothers I know of teenagers are of teenage boys are not themselves because they know that their sons are going in soon and that if the army needs combat soldiers, they will draft them as combat soldiers. You really don't have a choice. And the moms are freaking out. It's hard to live here sometimes. In a moment, I'm going to answer your questions, but first, I want to share a little bit of news. Next week, I don't know if any of you guys know this other podcast. It's an amazing podcast. It's called Sipur Yisraeli, Israel Story. If you're a fan of This American Life in the US, it's very similar to that. Ira Glass has called it the This American Life of Israel. Again, it's called Israel Story. And they also do these live storytelling nights where they invite Israelis to come up on stage and tell stories, 7 to 10 minute long in Hebrew. And they invited me to tell a story next week. So if you are in Israel, you should come on out. Next week, it's Monday night, the 24th of June in Jerusalem. I'll put a link in the chat before the end of the broadcast where you can buy tickets. But really, if you're in Israel next week on the 24th, go ahead, come on out. See me tell a story. The theme of next week is Am HaSefer, which means people of the book. So I'll be telling a story related to that theme. As always, you can get the links to the live recordings of Inside Israel at my website, joelchasnoff.com/podcast. And that's also where you can find the links to Apple and Spotify, where you can download this podcast if you can't see the live version. And hey, I do want to point out that it's Father's Day, 5 p.m. on a Sunday, and more than 100 of you came out. So I'm really happy to see that as well. Now, let's get to your questions. So we have 2 questions this week. First one is from Karen. Karen writes, I'd like to ask you about an issue I have not heard addressed anywhere else. We spoke to our son the other night as his birthright trip ended. He told us that when they visited the Nova festival site, this is in southern Israel, their guide told them that about 40 survivors of the Nova festival have since killed themselves. They've died by suicide. And she asked, had I heard anything about this? Yes, Karen, I have heard about this. This is actually one of those stories that's sort of under the radar in Israeli society. We know about it, but we really don't talk about it that much. To be honest with you, I'm not sure why we don't talk about it all that much. It reminds me of another story that we don't speak about much here in Israel, which is the fact that most likely some of the hostages at this point, the young women, are pregnant and soon to give birth. It's sort of, I think it's known that some of them are, but it's not spoken about. And I guess what ties these two together is maybe that they're just so horrible to even imagine and think about that we don't talk about them. But in terms of Nova itself, yeah, it is a known phenomenon that several of those who were attending the Nova Music Festival, but who were not taken hostage by Hamas and who were not killed, that several have since killed themselves, committed suicide. I did not know the number was 40. I will take this guide. These guides tend to know very well and be on the pulse of things, so I'll take him at his word. It's a very high number. I do know that there were many, not many, but some extenuating circumstances as well. A lot of the party goers that night at the Nova Festival were on drugs, and so when the, mind-altering drugs as part of the whole trance atmosphere, but when the attack happened on October 7th, these drugs drastically altered how they experienced the event, and so they've required new and different kinds of therapy. And there are very different and innovative therapies happening in Israel right now to help survivors of the Nova. Everything from water therapy to horse therapy, art therapy, and other non-traditional ways, because what they experienced was so different and so horrific. So again, Karen, I didn't know the exact number was 40, but it is something we've heard of here. It's certainly known that many of those who survived Nova have since taken their own lives. Randy said, Joel, on the podcast, you are outspoken in your criticism of the Netanyahu government. Have you personally been attending the weekly protests in Israel? Well, Randy, that's a good question. Like I said, I've been in the US pretty much constantly since October 7th. I have had a few breaks of 3 weeks at a time when I was back here in Israel, never more than 3 weeks. I always headed right back to the US for the next leg of the tour. And so, no, in those times when I have been back in Israel, I have not attended protests, mainly simply because those times here in Israel were a time to overcome the exhaustion and just get my bearings and adjust to life back here in Israel after all the travel and all the time on the road. Now, that said, I do want to say that before October 7th, I did attend a few of the protests against the judicial overhaul. So, yeah, I had gone to a few of those in Ra'anana. At that time, we were having protests all over the country, and I was going to the local Ra'anana protest. I've never been to one of the big, massive Tel Aviv protests downtown. Now, I'm in Israel now for 4 months. My next trip to the US, I'm here for the summer. I'm not going back to the US until October, and I must say I'm looking forward to living here, to actually being here and experiencing life, with my family as a civilian. So I guess the other question is, will I be attending the protests moving forward? You know what? I'll tell you the truth. I'm not sure. On the one hand, um, I don't know. I'm not for certain myself that it's what we need right now. I know that we need new elections. I know that we want a change of government. I also know that the more we protest, the more it emboldens Hamas and shows them that they can ask for more and more in order to get as many prisoners of their own released because we want the hostages back so badly. And it's a little more complicated than just calling for a hostage deal or protesting against the government. I personally believe that as complicated as much as I've blamed Netanyahu, I don't necessarily think that the onus is on him right now at this moment for there not being a hostage deal. There are a lot of these protests this past weekend were calling on the government to accept the current deal. I think we have. We pretty much proposed this latest offer. The United States has made clear that if there's not a ceasefire right now, it's on Hamas's shoulders. And I think Blinken even said at some point you need to question how sincere Hamas is when saying that they want a ceasefire, because pretty much everything they've asked for, Israel has offered, and yet they're still rejecting it. So I don't know that going out and demanding that Israel accept this deal is necessarily what we need to do. I also am sometimes bothered by the way that freeing the hostages has been conflated with other political causes. We had the Pride March in Jerusalem about 2 weeks ago, and leading the Pride March were members of hostage families, family members of hostages. I don't think that was the right move because hostages should be something that we're all behind, releasing them, doing whatever we can to get them out, not and it sort of makes it seem like it's a progressive idea or a liberal left-wing idea to release a deal for the hostages by having their family members lead the Pride Parade. So I'm not sure. I might at some point go to some of the protests, but for me, it's not a simple question. I also genuinely feel like my family's been doing a lot of good work. Dorit raising all the money she has on behalf of the IDF, and my speaking about Israel in the US while I was there. So now in the chat, here is the link for next Monday night. If you're in Israel, it's June 24th in Jerusalem. Click that link for the tickets to Israel's Story Night of Storytelling. Again, if you want more info on this podcast, if you want to watch the live recording, just go to joelchasnoff.com/podcast. And that's also where you can sign up for my newsletter, Hebrew is Magic. As always, please continue to send your questions to me. You can do it through the website or at joel@joelchasnoff.com. Thank you so much for joining. Our next broadcast will be next Sunday night, the 23rd of June, not Father's Day, at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. If you can't catch those, again, you can listen on Apple and Spotify and watch the recordings on my website. Until then, thank you so much for tuning in. Lehitraot in a good, safe, healthy week for all of Israel and all of us. I'll leave the chat open for one more minute. Laila tov.